So last week, the Conservatives won a sweeping majority in the UK's general election, and as a result, Johnson's government is now able to begin setting their agenda and implementing their plans. And they certainly don't seem to be dithering or delaying, with them almost immediately discussing Brexit, both regarding the vote that's set to take place in the House of Commons later this week, and the transition period. In this video, we're going to be discussing the latter, and Johnson's plans to force through his Brexit policy. Before we get into that though, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel. Back at the beginning of 2019, we asked you to help us get to 100,000 subscribers before Brexit happened. We're trying to reach 100,000 subscribers before the UK is set to leave the EU at the end of March. We're doing pretty well, but we want to be able to beat the UK. And we absolutely smashed it. At least partly because the process has taken so much longer than we thought. So this time round, we're going to ask you to subscribe and see if we can get to 350,000 subscribers before Brexit happens. Hit the button to lend us a hand and see if we can beat the deadline once again. Johnson's Conservatives were elected under the banner of Get Brexit Done, and it looks like Johnson is already trying to get that enshrined into law, with the government looking to make the UK's departure date from the EU a legal requirement. So let's take a step back so that we can make this issue as simple as possible. Let's rewind all the way back to June 2016, when the UK voted to leave the EU. Then Prime Minister David Cameron stood down, and in July 2016 Theresa May took his place. At the end of 2017, May triggered Article 50, giving the UK 2 years to leave the EU. Then, at the beginning of 2019, it became clear that the UK wasn't going to be able to leave in March of that year. And as such, they negotiated an extension to June, and then another extension to October, and then another one to the end of January 2020. And this is where the current deadline sits. And this is the date when Johnson is determined to lead the UK out of the EU. Completely separate from the exit date is the idea of the transition period. In October 2018, Theresa May negotiated a transition period with the EU, set to last for 22 months, through to the end of 2020. The idea of the transition period is that the UK and EU can use this time to adapt to the new agreement. During the transition period, the UK would continue to be part of the EU's single market, customs union and regulatory framework, so ultimately, very little would change. However, it would give businesses, individuals and governments the time to shift towards a new way of working, allowing for a smooth transition. So these are the two important dates right now. The end of January, when the UK is set to technically leave the EU, and the end of December, when the UK will leave the EU's framework and become truly independent. As the candidate for getting Brexit done, Johnson wants to get things sorted as quickly as possible, so he's not a huge fan of extending either deadline. He's already said that he'll be putting his deal back to Parliament at the end of this week, in order to get the UK out on the 31st. But that leaves one deadline looming over the UK and EU, the end of the transition period. This 11-month period is when the UK and EU will be negotiating their future trading relationship, how trade will operate between the two sides. Although Johnson calls it his deal, in reality, it's only a withdrawal agreement, and spends almost no time discussing a trade deal between the UK and EU. This means that if both sides want to protect trade between them, they'll need to establish a separate deal which enshrines protocols like tariffs, taxes, and quotas. While 11 months might sound like a long time, it's a really short period when it comes to hammering out trade relationships. The United States negotiators estimate that the UK-US trade deal will take around 7 years to finalise. The EU-Canada deal took 7 years to finalise, and it was 22 years in the making. So many people, especially on the EU side, think that 11 months won't be long enough to reach a deal, risking the UK leaving without a deal under no-deal terms that many have been hoping to avoid for a while now. Because of that, it was expected that the UK and EU would agree to extend the transition period. In fact, it was so expected that it's baked into the terms of the agreement. Article 132 of the withdrawal agreement states that both sides can agree to extend the transition by 1 or 2 years, potentially seeing the transition continue until the end of 2022. This would give the UK and EU more time to come to an agreement, but rules state that the extension would need to be approved by the 1st of July 2020. As I say, an extension was expected by some people, but these expectations began to fade when Johnson returned to number 10. Johnson's whole ethos is getting Brexit done, so he doesn't want to be seen as extending the deadline any further. He knows that his majority is propped up by people who want to see Brexit sorted, and if he reneges on that promise, he could see his popularity plummet. In fact, he addressed that exact issue in yesterday's cabinet meeting.
And we are going to be working to deliver on the priorities of the British people. We must recognise that people lent us their votes at this election. It was a quite extraordinary, it was a seismic election, but we need to repay their trust and work 24 hours a day, work flat out to deliver. The first 100 days were very busy, but you ain't seen nothing yet, folks. We're going to have to work even harder because people have a high level of expectation and we must deliver for them.
A quick aside, if you're thinking that you've not seen inside a cabinet meeting like this before, it's because you probably haven't. Letting cameras inside a cabinet meeting is not a common occurrence at all. And we'll have to see if this becomes a regular part of Johnson's government, or if it was a one-off PR stunt. Either way, Johnson is keen to stick to his promise on Brexit, and wants to make sure that all deadlines are met. To do this, Johnson's team are working to amend the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, which is heading to the Commons later this week. The new amended version would see a legal requirement added, which would make the transition deadline legally binding, forcing the UK to keep the deadline as the 31st of December. If passed, it would end the idea of the UK extending the transition period further, and lock that date into the diary. A spokesman for Number 10 commented on the new law, saying that the Conservative manifesto made clear that we will not extend the implementation period, and the new Withdrawal Agreement Bill will legally prohibit government agreeing to any extension. It's worth noting before we comment on the reaction to this news, that this lock might be a little less secure than it's being sold as. Like all laws, even if it is passed, it could be overturned in the future. So, if Johnson's team were to decide that an extension was necessary further down the line, then they could fairly simply overturn this law and extend the deadline. However, the purpose of the law is less about trying to tie down the government and more about focusing the minds of the UK and EU's negotiators. Johnson has previously described the 11-month transition as ample time, so his team are probably hoping that by ruling out the possibility of an extension, they'll force negotiators to work hard to get a deal sorted before the end of 2020. All sides will be fully aware that this move is more symbolic than anything else, as the law could be revoked in the future, but that doesn't mean it's ineffective. Sabine Wayland, the European Commission's Director General for Trade, said that I think given all the signals we're getting, and now these signals are translated into law, that we're well advised to take seriously that the UK doesn't intend to go for an extension of the transition, and we need to be prepared for that. Just because this message was understood by the EU doesn't mean that it will work in the long run. President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has said that the 11-month transition period is insufficient to negotiate a comprehensive deal, and that they would have to sequence talks to make sure the most necessary things were handled, leaving other issues unresolved. Simon Coveney, Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister, also commented on the decision, saying that nobody is forcing the UK to apply for an extended transition period. We all know that the negotiations post a British exit from the EU is going to be very complicated. It's going to deal with multiple areas, not just a free trade agreement. It has also got to deal with security, data, fishing. There are multiple sectors which require detailed negotiations. The EU hasn't missed a deadline yet. It has been the UK who has missed deadlines in the past. I just think that if we've learnt anything from the first round of Brexit negotiations, it is that we shouldn't be closing off options. Ultimately though, if the law is passed, then the idea of an extension becomes less likely, which will make things harder for negotiators. The decision could lead to a no-deal exit in December 2020, if the transition were to end before the UK and EU agreed to a trade deal. More likely though is that the UK and EU will strike some very basic trade deal during 2020, and therefore the UK leaves with less of a safety net than some might like. This means that while this law doesn't guarantee that the UK won't ask for an extension, or that they'll get a deal, it does mean that both sides are forced to readjust their expectations in the coming months. If you want to be updated as this plays out and as Brexit happens, be sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you want to be notified every time we release a video, tap the bell icon too. And finally, if you want to see your name at the end of the videos just like these people, then sign up to our Patreon. There's a link to that down below.